All right, and actually before I get started, I'm trying something a little bit new. I'm going to be presenting from Miro, but I've added a QR code, so you should be able to scan it and follow along. If not, E for effort, I guess. But if you're interested, I would be happy to share the slides with Jessica or disseminate them if people want to have access to this later. So it's great to be here with you this morning, and thank you so much, Jessica, for the invitation. Admittedly, anytime there's an opportunity to talk about anything that might slightly be related to politics, my ears perk up, and so this is just a way to bring some of my interests together. I want to be clear, though, that design is my expertise. I'm not a political scientist. I'm not a historian. I'm a designer who just really loves talking politics. So just with that understanding. The other thing I want to say at the outset is that I'm really approaching the discussion and presentation today as a conversation that was inspired by basically some experiences I've had in my teaching experience, where I've had a lot of really bright, engaged, creative students. And I think probably all of us in the room know a lot of bright, engaged, creative people who are interested in politics as well. I know a lot of people I talk to have strong political beliefs, and as I said, I enjoy engaging conversations. But I also have been thinking about the students who are also bright, engaged, and interested in social issues, but politically distance themselves. They don't want to talk about politics. And for whatever reason, there are lots of reasons, the word politics kind of probably makes us feel something immediately. Or maybe I could be speaking for myself there, but I think the word itself can sometimes make people feel things immediately in a way that we just want to kind of step away from it. So one of the things I hope to accomplish today with your help is to think about ways that we can invite, engage the people who are actually on the fringes of this conversation, who love design, who are good at design, who are great communicators, who care about the people around them, who care about the world, but don't see the connections between the things that they care about and their existence in the world and political realities. And I guess another thing that's important to add is that we are living in a time when our political systems here in the United States are under a lot of duress. I also just want to acknowledge that. And that's one of the reasons that I think the conversation today is so important. Certainly throughout the world, democracies are challenged in some places, and that includes here in the United States. So I also should be clear in saying that I do think it's very important for designers to be civically minded. If not politically engaged, civically minded. So we'll return back to some of these themes later on, but I just want to also be clear in terms of positioning myself in this conversation that I do think it's important for us to be engaged politically, civically, however you want to phrase it. Oh, by the way, yes, this is me. If you're interested in learning more about the Ongoing Matter project, there's a link for you. I should also give credit to my co-creator, Sarah Edmonds-Martin. Without her help, this project would have just been like a hobby thing that I was doing on the side. So since we began the project back in 2019, a lot has happened in that time. But our interest in this topic of civic engagement, civic design, has been sparked even through our own experience with this project. Important to acknowledge that conversations about politics are sometimes awkward and uncomfortable. So I just want to let you all know that, especially once we get into the discussion, I think people should feel confident to ask what they want to ask without being afraid that something they're going to say is going to be awkward or make people uncomfortable. All right, so I'm just going to start with a little bit of an introduction about me and some of my background, which I think is important in sort of helping you understand why I feel the way I do about all of these topics. So this is an image of my mom on the left, my dad on the right. My dad went to a segregated school in the South. My mom grew up in the Midwest, Ohio, to be specific. She's holding a snake in this photo, which is interesting knowing her. I still can't believe that she actually did this. But down in the left-hand corner, there's text that reads Loving versus Virginia. So I'm not going to give you a quiz right now, but I want to make you aware that that Supreme Court case, which was decided in 1967, was decided 2 years before these people got married. So when we talk about history, it's important to recognize that for some people, history is like not that long ago. Another important Supreme Court case, Brown versus Board of Education. So this is a family photo of us. I don't actually remember the specific year, but I'm the little baby way on the left with my mom and dad and siblings. So I'm a designer. My dad is a political scientist, retired political scientist and historian. My mom is a retired school teacher. She also taught children's literature. She also became a librarian. And then my siblings, my sister Melinda on the left, who is a theologian. So her PhD was in systematic theology. And then on my sister's right is my brother, the oldest in our family, who is a physicist. So his work and research is related to solar energy. So I mention this to say, like, yes, we're a family of educators, and education was held up as something really important, but also a reminder of the context that my parents grew up in, the context my dad grew up in particular. So education was really held up as something that was so valued in our home. And some of the things that my siblings and I have been able to accomplish would not have been possible without Brown versus Board of Education. So I've just given you two specific examples of ways in which legislation, of which the laws in this country have had an impact on me and my family. And maybe not super directly, but kind of directly. And I will also, I also wanted to kind of throw in some of these images. So when I was in the second grade, my dad was in law school at the time. We were living in Bloomington. And I had these creative writing books as part of my second grade class. And it's funny to kind of go back to this entry from February 6th, 1984. So the left is the image of the creative writing book, and on the right is what it says, including all the spelling errors. I'll just read it out loud. If I became president of the US, the first thing I would do, ... get excited, make peace, lower taxes, get rid of the bombs and missiles, I would faint, give food to the poor, let the soldiers see their families, and make everybody rich. So that gives you an idea how even as a second grader, and I can't tell you, I don't remember kind of how this conversation was prompted in class at the time, but it gives you an idea of like how my identity as a political person was becoming formed, and maybe what some of the conversations at home were like. So which brings me to kind of this next theme that I want to talk about, which is design identity and political identity. And notice I said design identity plus political identity as opposed to design identity versus political identity. And let's see, oh yeah, I touched on that. So while I talk a little bit about this particular theme, I'm going to ask all of you to think about this question of like, if you had to define yourself politically, what would that look like? And I'm not just talking about Republican, Democrat, Independent. If you think about the things or experiences in your life that have influenced you, that have changed you, and how those are maybe tied to politics, or even, I guess we could say democracy, how would you describe yourself? And one of the reasons I'm posing this question is because, you know, as a Black woman in the United States, I've had many, many, many conversations about what that means. or even what it means to be a mixed race person in the United States. Many conversations about that. I've also had many conversations about my identity as a designer. So it's an interesting question to kind of think about, okay, so if I strip those things away, how do I define my political identity? Now, for me specifically, it's hard to separate those things out because they're all enmeshed together. But I think it's an interesting exercise to kind of think about how do we articulate these things, and maybe it's awkward and uncomfortable to kind of think about, but I also think that it's an important part of narrowing in on this conversation about how we engage the people in our lives who are maybe on the fringes of some of these conversations. So these are just some examples of images of things that are designed, right? They're related to design. I'm sure there are people in this room who recognize this image. This one had a strong impact on me. It was the election of 2000, the butterfly ballot. Actually, let me go back a step. So this is obviously something that I have feelings about because I'm, again, a black person living in the United States. So this is part of history. This is also part of history, but it's a part of history that I was living through at the time. So this butterfly ballot basically upended the presidential election of 2000, and because of the poor design of the ballot, we ended up, the case, what was it, Bush versus Gore? Is that the name of the Supreme Court case? Anyway, it got bumped up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ultimately decided who would be president. So just sit with that for a minute. And then this symbol, the accessibility symbol. So if you're in the Miro board, you can see that I've included some links to some references. And I just want to give a shout out to a couple people because I'm not an expert in disability design, but I want to acknowledge people who are. Jen White Johnson, who's also in the Black Experience in Design. Josh Halstead, who is in the book Extra Bold. And then Elizabeth Guffey, who wrote a book about the accessibility symbol. So there are links to these folks in the Miro board, and I encourage you to, if you've never heard of them before, to check out the work that they're doing. But this is also something that is designed. These are all things that are designed that in my mind are directly connected to what happens politically in the United States. So the message being, of course, we can't divide ourselves from these things as designers. Okay, it's not separate from how we work in the world as people who are creative, as people who are visual communicators. So I'm going to move quickly now. I'm going to need Jessica's help to kind of stay on task here, keep moving, because I do want to have plenty of time for discussion. But I'm just going to show a few projects that I've worked on in the past that are also tied to some of these issues that I've been talking about. So it's about history, it's about being Black in America, it's about politics. So this is an exhibition for the Civil Rights Heritage Center in South Bend, Indiana. And the Civil Rights Heritage Center, again, I didn't include a link, which I usually do, but you can certainly look this up. It became a place for discussions about like civil rights. It's in the name of the title of the place. But it was also, the building was converted from a swimming pool that used to be segregated. So when you go into the building, you can see some of the remnants of that time, but in their narrative about the history of this place, they highlight the story of a young girl who has memory of going to the swimming pool to be turned away. She was a young Black girl, and that memory, of course, stayed with her for a long, long time. So the building has been renovated, but you can, as I said, you can still see the remnants of what it used to be. And it's an important story about history, yes, but also what are the civil rights issues of our day? Like, what are the things that we need to sort of continue to fight for? So these are just some images that show, again, the project. And I'm including it in the slides I'm showing today because it was something that it was a project I was interested in at the get-go, but it also don't want to say shifted my thinking, but helped me think a little bit more deeply even about history in general in the United States and how we talk about history, whose stories we include, whose stories we don't include. So if you're ever in South Bend, I encourage you to go see the Civil Rights Heritage Center. They're really wonderful people there. And then some images from Ongoing Matter, which I mentioned was co-created with Sarah Edmonds Martin. And this was directly connected to politics in that it was based on the Mueller report, which was published in 2019. This presentation isn't about Ongoing Matter specifically, so I won't go into details, but suffice it to say that for me, this was a design challenge. This was a question of how do I take my skills as a creative person and make information that is presented in such a boring way, Times New Roman 12 point to be specific. How do I present it in a way that people might be more interested in engaging with, if not the content, the story around the content? What is this about? So I actually did start reading the Mueller report. I mean, I did read the Mueller report, but when I started reading it, I was shocked at the information in there. So again, the Mueller report came out in 2019. It was an investigation by the Department of Justice about political interference, essentially, and the Trump administration. And the report, if nothing else, was a blaring alarm about how we need to safeguard our elections from 2020 on. And we can see the results of what has happened in that time. So these are just some images. My co-creator and I both have created posters for this, but we also engaged design friends and connections, anyone who wanted to participate, to include, to help us in this endeavor. So we had a traveling exhibition, and the exhibition itself, we haven't exhibited in about a year or so, but we've been working on other related projects. So it's still ongoing. It's still ongoing. It's a continuing discussion about the impact of the information that was in this report and just other government reports more generally. So since the Mueller report came out, there have been hearings about Trump's impeachments. There have been legal proceedings. There's all of this bureaucratic, let's say, content that has been generated. And how many of us have read those reports? How many of us sat through the hours of the Senate hearings about the insurrection? I mean, I'm sure some of us did. I want to say I'm sure some, because I did. I know some of you did. But more broadly, across the communities of people that you are connected to, how many of us? Yeah, this is just another poster from Ongoing Matter. So that's just a little bit about me and sort of the way I'm thinking about these things. But I think one of the other important parts that I want to make, points I want to make, is that however we think about ourselves politically or our identity when it comes to how engaged or not engaged we are within American democracy, legislative power is also a reality that we have to deal with. So when we think about the things we care about, how do we make sure that the things we care about are prioritized? I think we do that as citizens, as people who are active in our communities, but we also do that by voting, right? So I also included, I'm actually going to exit out of presentation mode here for a second, try to exit out. I included some of these terms because I'm sort of using civics and politics interchangeably. I know they're not the same thing, nor is democracy the same thing as civics, but I am sort of talking about them a little bit in an interchange. But I've included some of the definitions here in Miro as well. So that's why I'm scanning out a little bit so we can look at these as a whole. But it's important to remember, right? Democracy is, it's right there. It's government by the people. That means us. That means we have a responsibility. Whether we're designers or not, we have a responsibility. So the question becomes, how do we, again, invite people who are maybe on the fringes of some of these conversations into the fold, especially other creatives, other designers. And what is our responsibility? What is our role? So, with that, I don't know how we're doing on time, but I'm...
About 20 minutes in.
Okay, all right. So one of the things, and we'll get into this in discussion later, but I'm going to go through some of these prompts so that you have some time to think about them, because we will be circling back to them. I am an educator at heart, so I do want to hear from all of you. This initial question that I posed, how might you define your design identity? How might you define your political identity? Something different. And again, by political identity, I'm not talking about the way you might label yourself as a Democrat, Republican, or independent, or some other way, libertarian, I don't know. But I'm talking about going a little bit deeper than that. I'm talking about the things, like the experiences you've had that might shape the way you think about politics. So between design identity and political identity, do those things intersect with one another? Or are they like completely separate? For me, as I mentioned, these things are intertwined because politics has had a direct and indirect influence in terms of my family, but also things that I've been able to accomplish. This is a more general question. What are our ethical responsibilities as designers? And then the follow-up to that piece is, how are politics, ethics, civics connected? And really what I'm trying to get at through these questions is, like, how are all these things, how are all of them connected? Like, what are we, when it comes to our ethical responsibility as designers, when we come up against political issues, what does that look like? On a side note, I think it's important again to just remind you all of the political context that we're living in right now, where our systems, our democratic systems, are feeling pressure. The political rhetoric is really challenging for those of us who are paying attention and watching the news. It's a very challenging time, and it's a scary time. So that's, again, something to think about, especially in our role as people who communicate with other people. Some additional questions to think about. What are some of the challenges when it comes to engaging in conversations about politics in design education? So whether you're a practitioner or an educator or a student. And why is politics so seemingly disconnected from our lives? So to circle back to something I noted earlier, this talk was inspired by my experience with students who are bright, creative, engaged people, but when it comes to talking about politics, they take a step back. Why is that? And then, I think this is the last slide, maybe. What specific steps or calls to action can we take? So I enjoy talking. I enjoy having lots of animated conversations with people who are equally interested in the things I'm interested in. But beyond that, what are things we can actually do? Especially when, again, it comes to the people who are on the fringes of some of these conversations. I think it's probably fair to say all of us in the room, all of us watching, know at least one person that we connect with, that we consider to be a good friend, but maybe we know we just don't want to engage them in conversation related to anything political. So that's something to think about. And then how can we be more inclusive about addressing these topics and calls to action? So that second bullet point is really more about how we function in our roles as designers specifically. So beyond like knowing that maybe there's some people who are not politically aligned with us, how can we at least try to get people to sort of bring people into the fold, into conversation, to address these topics in ways that are more inclusive. And then, like, that, in my mind, that becomes a call to action in and of itself. I don't know. I'm posing it as a question. All right, so that's all I have in terms of my slides, but I'm really anxious to get into conversation about some of these things. So, yeah, I guess that's...
So we're going to move over here and then pass around mics and things.
Okay.
So thank you, Anne.
Okay, yes.
All right, thank you so much, Anne. Oh, this is a lot easier. We can just whisper. I want to start with one question, and then we'd love to hear. Anne has offered so many interesting questions as prompts, and would love to hear from all of you. One thing, and this isn't, we didn't plan this, so I just thought of this now.
That's fine.
One thing that you've talked about, like what is our ethical responsibility as designers? What is our stance? What are our politics? What do we not bring to our practice? What do we bring to it? Even within the halls of this building, as you know, I've had just, arguments and discussions with people about how design has traditionally been more of a service profession. Like, we have clients, we understand their needs, their users, and we serve that. It's not unto me to bring me into that.
Sure.
I would argue that that's not possible, and it sounds like you're making similar arguments. But how do you talk about that balance of, like, even the title of this, Design as Activism, is problematic for people? So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, I think there are always going to be people who don't think the two go together, design and activism, and I think that there will always be those jobs that, creative jobs that aren't really about anything political directly and that are more sort of service, like creating deliverables for a given client. But my short response is, like, look at where we are now in the United States. And by where we are now, I mean, I mentioned this earlier, the political discourse in and of itself. And think about how that impacts people in our communities. And it's also, in my mind, a question of access to information. I think that's part of it too. So let me circle back just a little bit. As I mentioned, I've taught in the classroom for many years, and I have students in class who are, they really diverse group of students. In the election of 2016, it was a really, really difficult time to walk into the classroom, knowing that Trump had won the election. I think everybody knows that. Given some of the political discourse that had happened, because then the question for me becomes, how do we talk about communication with students who are feeling under threat now? So, and I'm drawing a connection between political discourse and the words that are said and how that makes people feel, and then how they're able to, like, do their jobs, how they're able to learn, communicate. But I also think that, and this is one of the reasons why I shared kind of the accessibility piece, even though, again, that's not my particular area of expertise, but I think it's a reflection of, in the built environment, of how discrimination works, discrimination through design. So I think there are just many, many ways in which design has been a contributor to, and part of the problem when it comes to racism, like bigotry of all kinds, and that has an impact, direct impact on people's lives. So I think part of it is just recognizing the ways in which those relationships are already there. It's just whether or not we're choosing to identify or see them or acknowledge them. So you can stay at a distance if you want to, but I think that's a world that you're constructing for yourself. I don't think it's a reflection of reality.
Great, thanks, Anne. All right. I have a couple other questions in my back pocket, but I want to turn it over to you all. And we have our amazing assistants here, Meghna and Selena, who can pass a mic. Would anyone like to offer thoughts or responses to some of Anne's prompts? And I shouldn't have told you I had backup questions, but...
I have a question. I'm a teacher, and I teach younger kids. I teach 5th through 8th grade design. So I am thinking about how to include activism and politics in my classes, but I think a lot of times teachers are also told to be apolitical and not to bring their opinions into the classroom. So that's been something I've been, I don't even know what the balance is, but I'm wondering, like, if you've taught, how do you bring that into the classroom? How do you help kids investigate things? And then also, because I do have strongly held opinions, how do I bring those things up without alienating any of my students as well? Like if I have a student whose family is strongly Republican and there's a lot of values there that are hurting people, like how do I navigate that?
Yeah, this is a great question. I'm going to really try to stay focused on my response because there are like 50,000 things I want to say right now. But the first of which is you're not alone. Like I have had that internal mental gymnastics experience many times. And I think what I've landed on is rather than just coming in and saying, not that you're doing this, but I think rather than just say, we're going to have a political discussion, it's really looking at some of these specific examples of design through, I don't want to say a political agenda, but through like a legislative agenda. In my mind, that's kind of where Americans with Disabilities Act comes in, for example. Because my experience with Elizabeth Guffey, like, it was like the biggest light bulb moment ever when she's like, you know, they should be teaching this in schools. Like, designers need to know about this because it's the law. And I was like, whoa, yeah, it's the law. So that's one piece of this. What I have done in the past with students is they all know, if you talk to any of my former students from Cleveland State University, they'll be like, yeah, we did all these voting things with it. Anne made us always do some voting related project. But really my agenda was to get them to like study a little bit about voting laws and regulations. And maybe that would pique their interest to learning a little bit more about other things related to voting or legislation, or why are we getting rid of ballot boxes, kind of a question. Why are we making it harder for people to vote? So there is no like one right answer. I think it's really challenging, but the question I keep coming back to, even as in my own mind, I'm like, what does this mean? What do I do? What do I say? Our system of government is under threat right now. And that's not hyperbole. Like, we are in a very, very dangerous place in this country. And so, like, what is my responsibility in that? I can't do everything. I'm not gonna, like, save everyone. I'm not gonna save democracy, at least not alone. But I do feel that it's important to think about, well, and the other trick of this, right, is that things that shouldn't be politicized have become politicized. Even things like masking, which we do for community health or personal health, that can become a sign of like somebody's political identity or their political beliefs, actually. So that makes it trickier, but I think that the other thing I would suggest, specific thing I would suggest, and this is something I've tried with students as well, is to ask students what they care about. Do they care about health insurance? Do they care about being able to go to the library and use resources at the public library? Do they like being able to use public transportation? Do they care about the environment? And then from there, having some nuanced conversations about, well, how do we advocate for the things that we care about? And while it's important to protest, you know, when there are opportunities to protest things that we care about, that's really important. This is where, going back to something I mentioned about legislative and political realities, like we live in a political system. Change is not going to happen because we have lots of conversations about them. There has to be political will in order to make these things happen. And that's part and parcel of what it means to be in a democracy, is the other piece of this, the last piece I will say. We have to be engaged. It's not a privilege. It's an expectation.
Thanks, Anne. I think I saw a couple other hands as well.
Hi, Cheryl Dahl. I'm an adjunct professor here at Institute of Design. And I also am a consultant and have my own design practice, and at different times have experimented with hiring into organizations and trying to be a change agent from within. These ideas are really important to me. I teach on systems change here at ID, and some of what I've noticed is if you have students find the data themselves and find the connections, they can't help but see how all of these systems around us are designed to discriminate in multiple ways, intersectionally. I guess my question is, as someone who's neurodivergent, I really am not good at the game face or not saying exactly what's on my mind. And so let's just say I'm a really unpopular person at a lot of meetings because I'm saying the thing that nobody wants to say, and it's the first thing out of my mouth.
Yeah.
And that, trying to be a change agent within organizations, means you get ejected, right?
Yeah.
I don't really care if the reason I'm on this planet is to go lose my job at a bunch of places, but be a saboteur. I'm okay with that. But I guess my question is, should I be doing something else?
That's such a great question, and thank you for the way you are trying to advocate. I mean, it's true, especially inside bureaucratic system, any bureaucratic system. Like, everybody gets excited about the idea of change when it comes to actually making change, and it's like, oh, I have to have some responsibility. No, thank you. I don't have sort of a quick response for you. I'm still thinking about the question. I will say that I feel there are many times when I have to be very careful how I conduct myself. I think this is one way in which having allies in the room, whatever that means, can be really important, because those people need to speak up, especially if you know people agree with you on something. So I think maybe part of it is like building your own like coalition of support. But I think too, and I don't know you, and I've never been in a meeting with you, so I can't, I have sort of a limited context based on what you've said, but I think there is something to be said for building support because we're all going to disagree at some level, right? We're not all going to be in agreement all the time. But I think it's really about building support, at least on some issues. So let's say on your campus, it's not, I'm just pure hypothetical, it's not as accessibility friendly as it could be. It's important to find the other people who really care about these things and build a support system, and that becomes then a force to be reckoned with, essentially, especially when you're advocating for students to be able to access resources, access the building, versus just trying to take these things on by yourself or be the lone person who's always standing up, who's always saying the thing that nobody wants to hear. Like, what are ways that you can potentially, it's going to sound, I don't mean to sound sort of like glib about it, but like, how can you get people on your side? How can you like build those connections so that people become as persuaded and recognize how important this is? And I think sometimes that can be accomplished through like personal experiences and personal stories. That's the other thing that kind of ties back into the previous question too. Like, if you get people to kind of talk about their personal experiences with the healthcare system, in their jobs, in whatever it is, that has a interesting way of bringing people together. So I don't know if that helps.
Can I actually going to pull out one of my questions. Hold on. Because it's related to this. And I know you and I have talked about the work of Carl DeSalvo. I'm currently reading his book, Design as Democratic Inquiry.
I'm reading it too.
Neat. And brings up a lot of interesting ideas, also talking about not just democracy, but democracies, and so like things that are more like transferable to other contexts and working in civic environments. But he uses the work of Chantal Mouffe and other political theorists, the idea of agonism, that in any sort of democracy, there is actually no consensus.
Right.
There's always dissensus, there's always, I like how it's called agonism, but it means there's just always this conflict. And so you mentioned students and people being hesitant to speak about this. Like, that's not something we're taught very well either. How do you foster or facilitate that to happen?
Yeah, no, that's actually a really good point, because even you and I are not in alignment on everything 100% politically, right? Although it's probably 90% maybe, but not everything. Point is, not everything. So I will use a specific story and context from the classroom experience, and maybe that will help people think about how they can employ similar ways of thinking. So I mentioned what it was like teaching after the 2016 presidential election. So I was co-teaching, it was a typography class that I was co-teaching at the time, and I reached out to my colleague, Sarah Rutherford, and I was like, Sarah, so the election happened on a Tuesday, no class on Wednesday. I personally was like curled up in a ball in the fetal position. I really was. So I reached out to Sarah and said, how are we supposed to do class on Thursday? I don't know how I'm gonna do class on Thursday. And so what we settled on was we'll have class, but then we'll save 20 minutes at the end of class for an exercise as a way to, we didn't want to get into a huge debate because feelings were really raw, but give people a way to sort of express their feelings, whatever they were. So we did this, it's a prompt that I learned through some educational resources that I had gotten years prior, but we got a huge piece of butcher paper and put it up, and we gave students Post-it notes, and we gave them some specific prompts. So what are you feeling right now? Or like, what are your fears for the future? What are you hopeful about? And then some semi-related questions about like what communities are you connected to, and how can you use your design skills as a positive influence in your communities. So the first part of this exercise was completely silent. Students could only write their responses on Post-it notes and put them on the paper. We opened up discussion only on the questions about how might you use your design skills in ways to contribute to your community. Like, essentially, how can you use your design skills for good? But it also had this impact of allowing people to like get whatever was on their chest off their chest. And we ended up taking this huge piece of butcher paper and putting it out on the hall, and through the course of the next several days, I have photos, but students added more comments. And, you know, there was some disagreement about, you know, some people felt like people were too worried about what was going to happen, but some people were like, this is like a threat to my safety. So I think we have to make ways for that to happen in our conversations with people, that there has to be room for disagreement, even if we're generally on the same page. I think we're not very good at just sort of listening and acknowledging that, yeah, there's a difference there, but that doesn't make us any less connected or being afraid of being different on certain issues. Now, when it comes to your physical safety, now that's something different than like maybe different opinions about how or when people, you know, should we have a holiday for voting, you know, voting specifically versus, you know, whatever some other political or legislative issue might be. So there are some degrees of nuance here too, but I think I think part of it is just, if we take the idea that I just mentioned and we make that sort of a mental idea of people are sort of sharing their ideas, I don't have to respond to them. I'm just gonna like sit with them for a little while, whether I agree or disagree. And then maybe we can circle back to some areas where we have some things in common as a starting point for further discussion. Does that make sense?
It does. So that makes me think it's also offering space to not be immediately countering. So
Yes.
Creating some other environments
Exactly.
where ideas can be exchanged before we begin debating that. So thanks.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right, back to you all.
Hi, I have a question. Oftentimes in design education, we are taught to represent storytelling through a neutral mindset. We talk about the new normal recently, or not recently, but more in mainstream discourse. Are there ways that you are discussing on your own writing and through your new work, new ways to be the new neutral through storytelling in a very intense political environment?
So you'll have to help me if I didn't quite get your question correctly, but my initial response is like, there's nothing neutral about design ever. Like, it's just not a neutral thing. Because anything we create, like anything creative, it comes from a place. And we all have identities, we all have experiences. Like, what does neutral even mean? Because whoever you are, wherever you're coming from, you're bringing something to the work that you're doing. I think as a formal exercise, yes, design can look very neutral, but it's still coming from somewhere. Somebody created it, somebody designed it, somebody chose the typefaces, the colors, whatever, or made the thing, whatever it is. So So maybe even separating out like the formal aspects of something creative versus like what it is meant to communicate or who it's meant to communicate to. I just don't think we can ever be fully neutral in anything that we do. So I actually think that I've tried to become more, I've tried to become clearer in saying, I'm not coming from a place of neutrality. Here's where I'm coming from, though, and you can decide as the audience for yourself what you think about that, but I'm just going to try to be transparent and honest about how I'm approaching this thing that I'm making or the conversation we're having or what I'm writing about. Does that help?
Thanks.
I think there's also something there too about it's not just, yes, it's my identity, where I'm coming from, but also the materials, the typeface, everything that I choose and use has a history to it, has
Yes.
politics to
Yes.
it as well.
Yes, yes.
Yes.
Thank you. My name is Ruth Aguilar. I am here representing the Arc of Illinois, the disabilities population. So I am blown away for every word that you just said. And I don't really have a question, more of a comment. And I am hoping that our director, Samantha Alloway, and Shirley Press are watching this because I really want to invite you to the Arc of Illinois and have you showed us how we can do design as activism. This is just amazing. So my question is, will you be willing to join us?
So thank you so much for your comment. I'm willing, but I want to first acknowledge go back to some of the folks I mentioned, Jen White Johnson, Josh Halstead, Elizabeth Guffey. Those would be my go-to first because they are people who are writing about it, researching it, living it. So yes, but with a caveat that I hope you reach out to, and I'd be happy to put you in touch with him also. And I will also share a personal story about part of the reason, I can't remember if I mentioned my former colleague Robert Sedlak earlier during my talk, but he really was part of the reason that this hit home for me. This is somebody who was over 6 feet tall, extroverted to the max, really loud, could be very obnoxious, but like such a good person. Anyway, he was my design colleague at the University of Notre Dame. Athletic, he'd run marathons. I mean, yeah, when I say extroverted to the max, that's just like how I picture Robert. Really wonderful human. Robert was diagnosed with ALS, I think maybe 2 years after I met him. And so over the course of my time working with him at the University of Notre Dame, I saw his physical health deteriorate. And man, was that eye-opening. Because not only was I seeing his physical health decline, but I was noticing more and more how difficult it was for him to be able to do all the things he used to be able to do. Like getting into the building. Like what good is having an elevator in the building if you have to go down or up a flight of stairs to get there? Sorry. So there were moments where it was really scary, actually. I was afraid for him, just like in the way he was able to kind of move around, but you know, he was the kind of person who was always forging ahead and always found a way. But I think that it just really hit home that the way this world is designed, I mean, all of us are gonna have some run-in in some way, whether it's a physical disability or maybe it's something mental, emotional, that's gonna hit us in some way, and boy. I mean, I also have a mother who has dementia, and I think about how hard it is to travel. I take the subway every day, and like, if I was already challenged in some way, physical, emotionally, mentally, how would I navigate this system? I actually think about that every day. So that's kind of where I'm coming from with all of this, recognizing that it's not my area of expertise. I'm just like part of this system where I'm like, this isn't right. What can I do? And maybe I need to find the people who can help hold me accountable, and I can do a better job in some way.
Hey, hello. Yeah, so I just want to say thank you so much for everything you have said today. It has all resonated with me a whole lot. One of the things that I noticed you were talking about is when people are hesitant to engage in politics and political conversation. So in a social setting, that is not me at all. You know, I'll walk into a room and I'll say, hey, free healthcare, free Palestine, you know? But it's very different when I'm at work. So it's funny, I'm actually wearing my employer's logo right now, but there was a recent PR thing that came out where, you know, we basically got canceled by MAGA for being quote unquote too woke. And basically the higher ups told us, hey, yeah, no more employee, you know, identity ERGs, no more LGBTQ groups, no more Asian identity groups. We can't sponsor pride parades anymore. You know, the list goes on. And, you know, while that's frustrating, it's also very frustrating because it affects a lot of the things we're talking about, you know, especially the things I work in on a day-to-day basis, like accessibility and environmental communication. And, you know, a workplace is not a place that, you know, I definitely want to, I guess, stir up the pot in for obvious reasons. But at the same time, you know, I'm someone that's not afraid to engage in political conversations. But my question is, how do you navigate that in the workplace when you know that there's a good chance that people in your workplace might not agree with you, and you know your job can be at risk if you push it a little too far?
Well, this is the challenge, right? I mean, I work at a public institution. I've been working at public institutions for a long time now, and I have limitations, or at least that is to say, I feel that I have some limitations, right? And what I'm saying in a particular kind of setting. So there is something to be said, I think, for diplomacy. I'm not just trying to let myself off the hook. I think there is something to you know, trying to be diplomatic. And let me also just say that I'm sorry for your work situation. That's really unfortunate that that happened. But I would also say it kind of, I guess for me, goes back to, for lack of better phrasing, like some coalition building. I mean, there may be limitations in your job at what you can do, but what can you do outside of your job? And even in the workplace, I think one of the things I've started to get better at is thinking about, and again, it's tricky because things that shouldn't be political or politicized have become politicized. But you look at the accessibility symbol, like the wheelchair symbol, and I showed you an outdated version of it actually, but to me that symbolizes an opportunity to have some conversations about politics in a way that is about like making the world better for everybody. So maybe the conversation isn't directly about a particular senator or legislator or political party that is preventing us from doing X, Y, Z, but at least using, like, when it comes from a design perspective, what can we do to actually make it easier for the people that we're serving to do X, Y, Z? I mean, the short answer is I don't know. I don't know, but I feel your pain, but I'm just posing more questions as a way to say, like, it might be that it has to be outside of work, that you're advocating for these things. I'm not trying to give you more work outside of work, but I think that, it's important that you are holding fast to your ideals as well. I attended a private institution for college, and we came under fire. This was pre-MAGA days, but because I'm a pacifist. I come from a pacifist background. In my institution, we don't fly the American flag at athletic events. And that we've been not flying the flag at athletic events for many, many, many years. But it just so happened that some right-wing radio person caught hold of this, because I think it was during the Iraq War. Somebody caught hold of this and was really upset about it, and then suddenly, Mennonite institutions were besieged with, why aren't you flying the American flag? So, I'll just leave it at that. But, so I have some sense of understanding of where you're coming from. I just don't have a great response other than the work continues anyway, and even if it's just in your own personal life, trying to make yourself more available to have conversations with people, or even that can be really important. It's like all the things. It's not just one way, right? And it can be tricky in a work environment. And especially if you're working with somebody who has very different political beliefs, you're not just gonna go up to that person. I mean, you said this yourself and say free healthcare, let's duke it out. But then again, lastly, think about personal stories. Like sometimes if people have the opportunity to share a little bit about what they've experienced in life, that has a way of getting stuff out of people, that maybe there's a way to have additional conversation. Does that help? I don't know. It's tricky.
And I would also encourage for folks who have other ideas about your question or other questions to seek you out and have some conversations throughout the day about that. It's really important. I think we have time for one more question.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Rugg. I'm here from UIC, where we're so lucky to have Anne with us. I'm so happy that you're here in Chicago and we get to be having this conversation. It's so great. I really appreciated the powerful piece about disability and design, and I think my question has to do with what you were just talking about in terms of, but maybe not just about sort of one's personal behavior at work, but for the field of design, which is not my field. I'm here as a fan. I'm interested in the notion of neutrality, or when design work is really perceived as service work, and let's say you're just super involved as a designer in corporate capitalist culture, as a field, how does design think about activism there? Because it seems to me that that's, is the activist work of design only in projects where the client is the people, as we've heard Kamala Harris say, so, is it really only when it's redesigning the ballot, or can it be when you're working deep inside of capitalist culture at, major corporations? Not just in terms of how one conducts oneself individually at work, which I think is really complicated, and I'm not trying to dismiss that, but as a field, how does design think about that? Or how do you think about that?
Well, I guess I think about it that activism from that perspective, yes, activism happens anywhere and everywhere, right? And I do think there is something to be said for being a change agent within a bureaucratic system, because that's how I think of organizations oftentimes, bureaucratic systems of one kind or another. But it's an interesting question. I mean, I will say that for me personally, I've always gravitated to places or spaces or projects where I don't feel those kinds of constraints. But I think that there is something really important about it as well. I mean, think about climate change maybe as a parallel sort of topic, in that, even corporations can get behind policies that support policies in favor of, green design, green energy, because there's political pressure, or there's pressure from within. Now, sometimes that may come down to money and bottom line, but I think the key is that if policies are popular, or if ideas are popular, then I think that creates a way forward. And, designers, we need to be ready to push sometimes. Even if it's no, we're not gonna do that. I think we just can't afford to be silent. So I think whatever space people are working in, there are also like, it doesn't have to be large ways either that we're trying to make change. I think small changes can be important too, even if that's just making sure that, well, I call it a small change, but that people are able to get into the building without, if they're using a wheelchair or some other device. Like, to me, that's kind of a small change, but it speaks to how an institution thinks about people and treats people.
And I just want to build on that and say that is my favorite kind of question, and I'm happy to share the entire lit review of my dissertation, which tries to get at that question, is how people think about it. But I'll just turn it back to today, is that we've been intentional in trying to ask folks to come and speak about what can you do, like inside of a Salesforce or I shouldn't say, or another organization that one might be wearing a sweater of. And so I would really love to hear more about how people think about that question throughout the day. It's fantastic. So, well, we have to wrap it up, and I have to go through a couple of logistics, so let's all thank
Thank
Ann
you.
Berry.
Thank you.